Welcome to AHDB Agronomy Week 2020. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we wanted to remind you of a few points of housekeeping. You're all on mute, so don't worry, we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to last between 1 and 1.5 hours, including questions. We want this session to be as interactive as possible, so please post your questions throughout the session using the live Q&A function in the Agronomy Week platform below. We're recording this session, so if you miss anything or would like to watch it again, it will be available on the AHDB YouTube channel and AHDB website. You can also come back and watch the recordings on the Agronomy Week platform for 3 months. At the end of the session, we'll provide you with unique BASIS and Naroso codes. Don't forget to complete the BASIS and Naroso forms using the relevant tabs on the platform. You have 2 weeks after the live session to register for your points. Join in the conversation online. Follow AHDB_cereals and AHDB_potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag Agronomy Week. If you have any issues with the conference platform, there are digital event FAQs in the menu on the left-hand side. You can use the Help tab to contact the team if you experience any technical problems during the week. We hope that you enjoy Agronomy Week 2020. Thanks for joining us. Your session will now start.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this morning's session. This is part of the Agronomy Week, and we are on day 2. We've got a great lineup this morning of speakers, a very busy session coming up, and just a few introductions before we get started. We have Ambro with us, who's from the Organic Research Centre, Paul Gosling, who's part of the AHD team of cereals and oilseeds, and works as a research manager covering the diseases of weeds and fungicides. Harries will be joining us, who's part of our crop health and protection team at AHDB, also looking at diseases of cereals and oilseeds. And then Patrick, who is an independent agronomist based here in the Northeast and has been doing for 30 years. I'm Rose, and I'm going to be your host for today. Hopefully you all picked up Emily's housekeeping slides at the beginning. If you have any problems, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. But like she says, these are very informal sessions. Please ask questions, get involved, and find out what you want to know. The BASIS points will be available at the end if you just hang on and take note of the code. So without further ado, hopefully we've got started all right. I'm going to pass over to Catherine to start with. No, apologies. I'm going to pass over to Paul to start with. And he's going to take us through the highlights of the recommended list this time. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks, Rose, and good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Gosling, and I manage the recommended list programme at the AHDB. I'm just going to give you a very short refresher on the recommended list programme before we move into what are the more interesting presentations today. So the recommended list programme is a consortium between ourselves at AHDB, the BSPB, which is the British Society of Plant Breeders, which represent the plant breeders' interests within the recommended list, the MAGB, the maltsters, and NABIM, who represent the millers' interests. So I think before we discuss any further about the recommended list, we need to ask what its purpose is. And the purpose of the recommended list is to look at new varieties. We really focus very much on new varieties and ask which of those have a balance of features that are sufficiently better than the existing varieties, such that they can provide a better economic return. Because growers aren't going to switch from a variety that they know and they're used to growing unless they're pretty sure a new variety is going to offer them something better in terms of economic return. There is a second reason for the RL to be in existence, and that is to supply information on grain quality and consistency for the processors, because our processors, the NABIM and MAG members, are also levy payers. So I just want to have a quick review of how the system works, because I think that will inform, as in the discussions, what comes out the end of the system. So this is what we call the pyramid of selection. I've chosen winter wheat because it has the most variety, so it looks more dramatic. But this is a system which happens for all the varieties. So we have 11 crops, including our descriptive lists, nearly 450 trials a year, RL trials, and around 42,000 plots just in the RL system. So what happens up here? The breeders make their crosses, which they hope are going to turn into good varieties. And for wheat, we're looking at something like 800 lines produced every year. The breeders then make their selections every year of those lines, which are the best ones, and they put those into year one national list trials. And I'm sure you're aware varieties need to be nationally listed before they can be sold as seed in the UK. At the end of year one of national list trials, the breeders will select the best of those to go into year two trials. And at the end of year two of national listing trial, the breeders allow us access to the data from these trials, because this is breeders' data, it's not our data, and that's their contribution to the RL is allowing us access to this data. The different committees, in this case the wheat crop committee, then looks at that NL data, picks the best of those lines to put into recommended list trials. At the end of 1 year of recommended list trials, we have 3 years of data, 2 NL years and 1 RL year, and the committees make their decisions on which varieties will be recommended. And from those 800 odd lines at the start, we'll probably get maybe half a dozen varieties added onto the recommended list each year. How do they select the varieties? Well, there are different criteria, different importances for different crops, as you'd imagine. So this is, again, it's wheat. So we've got different criteria, or different importance criteria for the different groups. So obviously for miller's assessment is a very high importance, for example, for group 1 and 2 wheats, whereas it's of low importance for group 4 wheats. And different criteria say weighted quite differently in agronomic factors as well. So lodging with PGR is a very high importance when we're considering varieties. No one wants to see crops going over, whereas height is of low importance, but we still consider it. In terms of disease, we rate the importance of diseases differently as well. So Septoria is rated very high because we know that even with the best fungicides, you can't always get control of Septoria, particularly in years when it's wet. 2014, 2012, you could throw everything at it and you still can't control Septoria. So varietal resistance is important. Yellow rust is high. We know it can be a devastating disease, but at the moment we have the chemistry to control it. Once we lose epoxiconazole, who knows? Maybe we'll have to reconsider that, and that might go up to very high importance. And the importance of different factors in considering varieties changes with region as well. So in the north, distilling quality is of very high importance because obviously that's an important market up in Scotland. And one thing the recommended list sometimes gets criticised for is it's focusing too much on yield. Sometimes people say yield is everything. And indeed, yield is very important in selecting varieties. We know that growers want varieties that are going to yield well. And so we rank the varieties and their UK yields on the market segment. So for instance, group 3 biscuits will be ranked in order. We then set a yield target for selection, which is generally the highest yielding variety, which is on the current recommended list. Varieties that are more than 2% above that yield level will get automatic selection if they meet minimum standards and specifications. Varieties that are less than 2% above the yield target and those that are higher but don't meet the minimum standards will be reviewed. But because they're higher yielding than anything that's currently available, they will generally get recommended unless they have a weakness. Varieties that are below the yield target, generally we'd expect not to recommend them unless they have a strength other than yield. And varieties down here, more than 2% below the yield target, are unlikely to get recommended unless they have an exceptional strength. What do we mean by strengths? Well, we use comparator varieties to assess strength. So these are varieties selected by the committees which have good agronomy and good quality characteristics. So if a variety doesn't quite make it on yield, but is better than the comparative varieties on quality, disease resistance, agronomy, then it can still get selected. But just an example of that, a couple of varieties. This year we recommended Swallow winter wheat on quality. It was 4.1% below the yield target, so right down here in this requiring exceptional strengths. It was recommended for the North region only. That was largely due to having excellent distilling quality, well above all the other varieties in terms of alcohol yield. So that got recommended on quality, even though its yield was well below the yield target. Last year we recommended Theodore winter wheat on disease resistance. Again, it was 4.1% below the yield target, so well below that yield target. It was recommended for the West only because of exceptional disease resistance. Now, varieties like this aren't going to be varieties that are going to take 10 or 15% of the UK wheat area, but they have qualities which are going to be of interest to growers in certain regions, looking to supply certain markets. And so we will recommend a variety, even if it's yielding well below target, if it has some special quality that we know growers might want. Another way that varieties can get onto the list with lower yield targets is as specialist varieties. The specialist varieties are those that have specific traits that may be attractive to farmers in certain circumstances. Specialist varieties have different yield targets, they're lower than the main targets, and that means they can get onto the list even if they don't yield so well. The reason we have specialist varieties is to introduce innovation to the list and to cater for small markets. Innovation, a good example there is for turnip yellows virus in oilseed rape. So when turnip yellows resistant varieties were first introduced, excuse me, they weren't yielding as high as the elite varieties. So we introduced a specialist category to get those varieties on the list. Now the breeders have done a very good job in putting that resistance into mainstream varieties. And so even the highest yielding varieties now have turnip yellows resistance, and that specialist category no longer exists. But we do have some we retain in the long term. These cater for small markets. A good example is grain distilling. It's a small market in Scotland, but it's an important market. Clubroot resistance is another example, and Hull. These are variety types which are never going to take the whole or even a large proportion of the seed area, crop area, but it's important to have those varieties with those traits on the recommended list. And as breeders put more and more new traits into varieties, we've seen BYDV resistance come on this year. We're likely to see more specialist categories and varieties recommended on the basis of specific traits. Just very briefly describe lists. These are for the minor crops, the linseed, spring oyster, rye, triticale. We do only have a small number of trials for these descriptive lists. For the wheat list, for example, the yield trials, we have some varieties will have in excess of 200 trials going into those yield figures. For the descriptive list, we've got far fewer. And because of that, when you're looking at varieties on the descriptive list, the differences between them in some areas, particularly the yields, is not often statistically significant. So just be cautious with using the descriptive lists. We add varieties to descriptive lists if they're national listed and if seed is likely to be commercially available. But it's not a recommendation. It's just to provide information on those minor crops. Just a very quick word about a couple of points on the tables I just wanted to reiterate. One is on control varieties, marked with a C. So these are not our highest yielding varieties. These are varieties that are established in the market and provide a stable yield platform, because we use our controls to work out what our yields are in terms of percentage of controls. We know the yields are in recommended list trials are higher than anything you get generally in commercial situations. That's just the nature of trials. LSDs is our measure of statistical significance. If the variety is less than that number apart in terms of whichever characteristic you're looking at, it's not statistically different at the 95% level. Now, you could argue in order to change varieties, you don't need to be 95% certain that they're different, but that's perhaps a discussion for a different day. That's just how we represent statistical significance. But just beware for figures that are bracketed. That means there's less data for those figures. And when you're comparing varieties that are bracketed, the LSD, the significant difference will be larger. And if you're comparing two varieties which are bracketed, you've got two varieties which are both have limited data, then that statistical difference will be even larger still. So you really need to have quite big differences between bracketed figures to make sure they're really different. There's quite important information in the footers, so don't forget to look at the footers. Sometimes people focus just on the table, but there's important information down here as well. Just a couple of points on disease. First of all, the untreated yields. Untreated yields are becoming more important as growers look to cut back on fungicides to reduce costs, and also for environmental reasons. LSDs tend to be higher on the untreated yields, simply because untreated yields are more variable. Depends on how much disease you get in this crop, so just be aware when you're looking at untreated yields. And the disease, just to point about the disease ratings, the differences between disease ratings at the high end of the scale, so 7s, 8s and 9s, are smaller than the differences at the bottom end of the scale, so 3, 4s and 5s. And that's because it's a log scale. So difference between a 7 and 8 isn't that great. The difference between a 3 and a 4 is really quite large. Just something to consider when you're looking at those disease ratings. Just very briefly, a bit of promotion work. All this is on the Recommended List website, and we've just released the new data yesterday, so all the new tables are available on the website. The publication is going to keep going for a long time yet. People like the publication, we'll keep producing it. And we also have the app out now, which can give you the recommended list, all this information in an app form in your pocket. On the website, you'll also find things like protocols. So if you want to understand a bit more about how the trials work, you can read that there. And also there's all the crop committee handbook, which shows you actually how the crop committees make their selections on the basis they do that. And there's a big archive of old material as well there. So if you want to go back and look at old varieties, perhaps which have dropped off the recommended list, now there is still information available for those. So just in summary, the RL is an open and transparent assessment of the merits of varieties. You can see how it's done, you can see the protocols, you can see how it all works, you can see the data behind it. We're not favouring anyone's varieties over anyone else's. Everyone has an equal chance of getting their varieties on the list. Does the RL do everything? No, it doesn't. I'm sure we'll hear from Patrick and Amber. There are areas where the recommended list is lacking. I'd love to be able to do everything, and if I had £10 million, perhaps we could do. Does it have all the answers? No, we can't do everything. And that's where people like Patrick come in, the agronomist comes in to interpret the recommended list, fit the recommended list in with the local information, the local knowledge that the farmer and the agronomist has to find out the right varieties. Could it be improved? Yes. There's always room for improvement. We're always we're always reviewing it and seeing where we can change things. This year, we've seen some big changes to the rust ratings in wheat. We've also had introduced new ratings for disease for rye and triticale. This year, over the winter, we'll be looking at the lodging ratings because we think we could do better with lodging ratings. So yes, we're always looking to improve it. And finally, the RL should be seen as a starting point for variety selection. It's certainly not the end, and that's where your agronomist comes in and your local experience, as I already said, comes in to use the recommended list as a variety selection tool. It's certainly not the end in variety selection. And hopefully next year we'll be able to see some of you at some of our events, and we'll all be able to get out and see some varieties actually in the field. And that's the end of it for me. Thank you. I'll take questions now if you have any.
Thank you very much, Paul. And it's great to see you highlight the amount of work that goes into the recommended list and the selection and criteria that there is. Just one quick question before we skip on to our next speaker. The RL candidates list for 21 does not contain national list data. When does this become available?
So we can't legally release data on varieties until they are nationally listed. So as soon as those varieties get listed, we will update the app and the website. So as soon as they're listed on the national list, we can release that data and it goes up on the website and the app.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Paul did highlight the publications that were available, and just to reiterate that they are on the AHDB website. If anybody's struggling though, don't hesitate to get in touch. but the data behind those is really quite amazing and also very useful. So thank you, Paul. We're now going to swap to our next speaker, Catherine. Following on from Paul highlighting the disease ratings within his talk, Catherine's going to talk further about how the rust scores are evolving. Thank you, Catherine.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Harries and I work on the recommended list disease ratings at AHDB. So this year we've had quite a few changes to the way that the yellow and brown rust ratings are calculated. So I'm just going to take you through that today. Although some of these changes, excuse me a moment. Some of the changes are happening, so one of the changes is happening to brown rust, but all the changes are happening to yellow rust. So we're going to focus on yellow rust for the purposes of today's presentation. And there's a video with a broader explanation of all of this available on the AHDB YouTube channel, and that goes into this in much more depth. So the yellow rust pathogen population is monitored by the United Kingdom Cereal Pathogen Virulence Survey, and we've seen it's become increasingly diverse over the last few years. New races have arrived and we've seen the effect of these across the UK, with disease appearing on previously resistant varieties. And this has highlighted the changes required in calculating the recommended list disease ratings. So the changes we've implemented are a weighted rating and a reset slope. And then I'll talk a bit about information on targeting varietal monitoring. And that's a link to the video that explains this in more depth at the bottom. So the RR ratings haven't kept up with the changing yellow rust population, and the ratings aren't reflecting what's being seen in the field in many locations. So, for example, this picture on the right is of a trial untreated with fungicide. There's a resistant variety rated as a 9 on the left and a variety rated with a 7 last year on the right. So clearly the variety on the right has much more disease than that on the left and should be getting a much lower rating than a 7 if it's like this in most locations. And under the new system, which I'll explain in a moment, the variety on the right has now got a rating of 4, which is much more realistic. And the reason for this discrepancy isn't to do with poor quality data from RL trials, it's the way we've been using the data and the way we calculate the ratings that's causing the problem. So the first change we've made is to introduce what we call weighted ratings, and this is aimed at enabling the ratings to take account of the rapidly changing pathogen population, which it currently doesn't. So disease ratings tend to be calculated on the last 3 years of data, and this provides stable, robust and really reliable ratings. But until now, each year of data has contributed an equal amount to the rating. So, for example, 2018 would have had a weighting of 1, 2019 a weighting of 1, and 2020 a weighting of 1. And where pathogen populations are relatively stable, this method provides robust ratings. But where pathogen populations are dynamic, such as with yellow and brown rust, this method takes no account of the increased disease that might have resulted from races present in the most recent year or years that weren't present in the years before that. So where before the previous 3 years contributed equally, now the most recent year will contribute 3 times as much as the first year. So for example, for this year's ratings, 2018 has a weighting of 1, 2019 of 2, and 2020 a weighting of 3. And this means that varieties that have had more disease in the most recent year, for example, because it's susceptible to new race of yellow rust, will have lower ratings than they would have done if the previous method was used. So let's look at a couple of examples to explain this a bit more. Here we have variety A and variety B, and both their ratings are worked out using the old method, giving an equal weighting to each year. Variety A had stable levels of yellow rust, 8% in each of the 3 years, and variety B had increasing levels of yellow rust, so 6% in 2018, 8% in 2019, and 10% in 2020. For variety A, with an equal weighting, the average level of disease is 8%, leading to a rating of 4.5, which will be rounded up to 5 in the RL booklet. but the average level of disease for variety B when using this old method is also 8%, even though it's got more disease in the most recent year. And now if we look at what would have happened, what does happen to these two varieties using the new method, with the new ratings, variety A would have the same average level of disease, and so the same rating of 4.5 as before, but variety B would have its higher yellow rust rating of 10% in 2020 be given a bigger weighting, and its lower yellow rust level of 6% in 2018 a smaller weighting. This means it has an overall average level of disease of 8.7%, leading to a rating of 4.3, and this is then rounded down to a 4 in the booklet. So this shows how this new system gives relatively lower ratings to the varieties that appear to be succumbing to a new race of rust, such as variety B. But the beauty of the system is it'll only provide a different rating to before when the variety is becoming more or indeed less susceptible over the years. And overall, this has only caused small changes to the ratings this year. The second change we're making, and this is the change responsible for the big changes in the ratings we're seeing this year, is to reset the slope that's used to calculate the yellow rust ratings. The way that all disease ratings are calculated is by plotting the amount of disease a variety gets against a slope, which gives us the rating. And the slope is determined using known resistant and susceptible varieties to fix the top and bottom of the slope. This chart shows an example of a slope, and the green dots are different varieties that we're calculating ratings for. The problem has come when we've tried to reduce fluctuations in ratings between years. So normally this is the right thing to do because ratings shouldn't change much between years if there's no reason for it. But diseases such as yellow rust, where there are pathogen population changes, these changes have actually been real. So this has allowed the rating slope to gradually creep upwards over the years. You can see this was the slope in 2012. This was it in 2015. It's gradually crept up a bit, and this was it in 2019. And each time the slope gets less steep, it causes the same amount of yellow rust to lead to a higher weighting. So, for example, in 2012, 10% yellow rust would have received a rating of 4, but in 2019, 10%, so the same amount of yellow rust, would have received a rating of 5. And this has also meant that varieties that have become more susceptible each year due to the changing races have been given the same rating when they should have been given lower ratings. So what have we done about this? Reset the slope back down to the 2012 level. And this means, for example, that varieties with 10% disease will once more get a rating of 4. And this change has had a bigger impact on varieties with lower ratings than those with higher ratings. This chart shows the impact these changes, so the reset slope and the weighted ratings, have had on the yellow rust ratings this year. The blue bars represent last year's ratings and the green bars represent this year's ratings. And we can see that overall yellow rust ratings have reduced, but it's encouraging to see how many resistant varieties we still have compared to more susceptible varieties. In fact, over half of the varieties have a rating of 7 or above. And for those varieties whose ratings have dropped, it doesn't mean the variety has become more susceptible in 2020. Some of them did. For the most part, large drops are due to the way the ratings have been calculated. And when we look at the change in the brown rust ratings, remember these were only subject to the weighted ratings, not a reset slope. So there were many fewer changes. There are just a few more rated 5 and a few fewer rated 6 to 8. Something to bear in mind when using the RL yellow rust ratings is that these ratings reflect the resistance that adult plants have to yellow rust, not the resistance at the young plant stage. This is because varietal resistance genes against yellow rust operate at different stages of the plant's growth. So adult plant resistance should be operating by around growth stage 55, but this means that the T0 and T1 and sometimes T2 timings, the plant may still have its young plant. These times we might need a fungicide to keep a lid on the disease. So if you're growing a resistant variety that has young plant susceptibility, and you see disease on it before growth stage 55, it doesn't necessarily mean that the variety is broken down to a new race of yellow rust. And this slide shows varieties rated with a 7, 8 or 9 on the RL. On the left shows varieties that have susceptibility at the young plant stage, and on the right, varieties that are resistant at the young plant stage. And we can see that most of the varieties are susceptible at the young plant stage, so you shouldn't be concerned if you do see yellow rust on them before growth stage 55. The final thing I wanted to talk about is some additional information AHDB will be releasing about how to focus monitoring and management of the dynamic yellow rust population in the 2021 growing season. Although this information is based on RL trials, it's not intended for varietal selection and isn't part of the recommended list. And we're calling it the watch list. It aims to show varieties that performed out of line with the main recommended list yellow rust rating at some sites in the most recent year. And this may be able to indicate a variety's potential susceptibility to uncommon races of yellow rust, which at the moment aren't widespread. But this watch list won't be able to predict what changes might happen in the coming season. It's just based on the previous season's data. And this will be released in the new year. We'll do a video to explain it, like we have for the current changes, what it shows and how it can help with varietal monitoring. So finally, I'd just like to thank those who've helped with the development of these changes, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Great to see the work evolving with the yellow rust. Just a quick question for you before we move on to our next speaker. These ratings you are describing suggest single races are being dominant at certain times or in certain growth stages. However, there is evidence of multiple races being active on a single plant leaf, i.e. a soup. So how do you propose to account for this?
Yeah, that's exactly why we're implementing these changes. Previously, it would be one new race coming in. It was quite clear what varieties it was infecting, and it was rather more straightforward. But now we just have so many different races, and as you say, you can have like multiple races on the same leaf and they all come in at different times. It's just so difficult to keep track of everything and to keep the ratings representative of what we're seeing. And that's what these changes are aim to reflect. So with the weighted rating, it takes into account the disease in the most recent year, which will hopefully reflect the races that will become more prevalent. It may reflect races that are prevalent in that year and then fizzle out, but obviously we're not able to predict what races are going to increase and what aren't.
Fab, thank you very much. Do keep sending your questions through. We'll hopefully be able to look at all of these at the end. Thank you, Catherine. I'm now going to hand over to Ambro, who in collaboration with AHDB works with the Organic Research Centre. He's going to share his work with a network of farms to generate data sets that describe field performance of winter wheat varieties in low facility rotations. Thank you, Ambro. Ambro. Ambro, please can you unmute yourself and start again? Sorry. That's him.
Hello,
Brilliant.
can you hear me well now? Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm leading the crops team at the Organic Research Center, and I'm going to present this project that started in 2020, continuing a 2 years previous proof of concept experiment. We are working with Organic Arable and the AHDB about how to better support varietal choice in organic and low input systems. Just a very quick background about the project. We are working on organic wheat. And why are we working on organic wheat? Basically, wheat is the main UK arable crop, but organic wheat acreage is minimum and is steeply declining. It's basically halved in a decade, up to 0.5% of the total acreage. This is mainly because of poor and unreliable performance and wheat problems and failure to meet milling standards, etc. So this poses us towards facing two main challenges. One is in the short term, of course, we have a low production versus a very high market demand. So the need to increase homegrown production for organic wheat. But what I'm really aiming at, especially for the session today, is the long-term challenge, as will be seen extensively in the presentation after mine. What is a problem of organic farming today might well be a problem of the whole farming transitioning towards lower inputs tomorrow. And in this situation, that's why varieties come into the question, because varietal choice is the only real crop-specific decision an organic farmer can make in the absence of other external inputs. And this may be increasingly important decision in the future for all farmers with less access to external inputs, or whilst reducing costs or environmental impact. So this project is looking at organic wheat varieties, taking into account three assumptions that I would like to focus a little bit today. One is about varietal performance. The ranking of variety yields or quality, let's say performance in general, is different whether you test varieties in high input versus low input or organic system. If we've seen in organic farming that with no evaluation under organic conditions, this might lead to impaired varietal choice. But as well, if you see what Paul was showing earlier about all the steps of selection that you have going backwards in the breeding programs, if the breeding as well is not done in organic or low input condition, those useful phenotypes can just be overlooked and not making it to become varieties that may be useful with low inputs. Second hypothesis is about variability. We've seen this as well in previous presentation. When inputs are low, like for example into the untreated yields, the variability is higher than in high input. This is why organic and low input farmers put a lot of emphasis on consistency, their common keywords, instead of maximization of yield or quality, and is very high also in terms of space. That's why we need to harness the so-called genetics by environment, by management interactions. And the last point, which is the key point of this project, is the scale issue. The lower the input level, the less reliable the plot scale results are, meaning that what we see from plot trials is very accurate, is very statistically robust, but it's more difficult in organic and low input system to translate what happens in the plots to what's going to happen in the fields. That's why field scale evidence is critical to complement formal trials and validate them. So these are our objectives, are four basically, building a network. We call it a collective experiment. We have a network of farms that are linked by an experimental design. We build data sets to validate these plot scale results. We analyze this data to understand the drivers of performance, and we are aiming at generating outputs that can better support decision at the farm level, at the level of the supply chain, both seed production and grain supply chain, and also feeding back into plant breeding about what the better trait architectures can be in the future. The methodology, as I mentioned, is based on incomplete block design with a common control varieties. Basically, we're testing 20 varieties, and every farm is allocated 3 or 4 varieties. They drill the varieties as strips, as you can see in the picture on the top, with one of the varieties replicated on the farm to measure variability within the field. The research team collects data at GS 30 to 32 and at anthesis, mostly looking at crop morphology, cover and diseases, and yield components, with a specific focus also on weed abundance and community composition, and then grain yield and quality standard analysis, but we will include further and more specific analysis from this year on. And this is just a snapshot on the farms that we have 19 sites this year, 5 of which are working with us, 6 of which are working with us for the 4th year, and 4 of them just joined us. 4 of these farms are non-organic. We call them conventional agroecological because they're either conservation farms or very low input, no-till, and etc. And we're going now quickly over the results. These are mostly example. Please bear in mind these are just interim results. Data from last season are not complete, and in no case these are going to be intended as recommendations about varieties. This is really a research project that tries to improve the way we understand things. So we're looking at these examples under the acronym of genetics, environment, and management. A first look at the genetics. We saw that there are 2 clusters. One cluster of varieties that have a high yield and relatively low protein. These are data from organic farms only across 3 years. And you see here group 4 varieties plus the group 2 variety C-scheme. Just a note, the white dots are just varieties that have been tested only 1 year, so we're focusing on the black dots for today. And we have another cluster of varieties that have lower yield but higher protein. Another interesting thing is that we can observe potential so-called yield protein deviations, so varieties that have higher protein level considering than would be expected considering their yield level. And these are this Mariswegian and WayQ CCP, which is a population progeny of crosses. But for what is worth now is that these 2 are both historic phenotypes, slightly taller, Mariswegian dating back from the 60s, and WayQ having parents that are also historic varieties. What is interesting is that looking at the genetics into organic fields, we could also find, as you can see from this astonishing picture, evidence of differential weed suppressive ability in varieties. And what is even more interesting, if we look at the abundance of weeds along all the varieties, is that the best weed suppressors are exactly those who were potential yield protein deviations. And this suggests us a very important thing, meaning that actually nitrogen use efficiency, so better use of nitrogen in organic and low input system, may be very much linked to the competitive ability against the natural weed communities. And in this case, historic phenotypes seem to have improved better. This is all, of course, to be validated with the further year. Let's go to the environment and very quickly show that as we saw the trade-off between yield and protein when looking at varieties, this does not need to be translated in looking at the trade-off when we look at the environments. On the contrary, if you look at the different farms over the different years, what we see is that if we have 2 sites, the site that has the highest yield potential is likely to also have the highest protein potential. So each site will play with a yield protein trade-off across the varieties, but if a site has a higher yield potential, it will possibly also have a higher protein potential. So we shouldn't just maximize yield at the expense of protein. We also see that some farms have higher stability than others, and this is an entry point into understanding the management. But let's have a last look at the results. We saw that we went through 3 very strange years, 2017 and 18, with a particularly dry summer. And if some of you have heard the session yesterday, knew that 2018 summer is very much the trend that is expected according to the latest model to be the typical year in 50 years time. We had in the last year a quite higher summer rainfall, and in this 2020 harvest season, a strange combination of autumn, let's say, flood and an unprecedented drought during the spring. How this was translated into crop indicators. You can see here the distribution of the individual observation points under 4 variables. The first thing that you see is that with the spring drought in the 3rd year, both the weed abundance and the severity of diseases is very much concentrated on the low level compared to the previous 2 years. And in terms of yield and protein, we see that the spring drought in the last year has reduced the yield compared to the other years, whereas it hasn't really reduced the protein. The protein were really reduced with the summer drought of 2017 and 18. And let's go then on the management. Management now, for the data we have available so far, is especially something looking at the weeds. And if we take the first 2 years with only organic farm, this is something we really learned working on the farms and with the farmers, that there are 2 main approaches that farmers use to manage weeds. One is the classical weed drilling in narrow rows with post-emergence springtime harrowing. The other one, as you see in picture C, is drilling wheat in wide rows. We're talking about 25 to 30 centimeters, and managing wheat with a power hoeing during the season. We saw that variety by system interaction is there and needs to be investigated, meaning that some varieties perform better in one system or the other, but we need some further years, this further year to better understand that. But what we saw is these 2 systems have different effects. The wide rows and power hoeing system is more intensive, more effective and climate independent. In fact, wheat abundance under the wide rows was significantly lower than in the narrow rows farms. As well, being more intensive system, it can also have a higher risk of dominance. Basically, what this chart says is that in the farms with power hoeing, the tendency is to generate a dominant weed that in many cases is wild oats, whereas the higher weed population in the narrow rows farms tends to have a more diversified weed community. And the last piece of result is about this year, which generated we collected data on 4 drilling season and always on weeds. We could have, with the entry of conventional farms, a difference. And we saw that actually the use of herbicides did not actually reduce the abundance of weeds because weeds were higher, especially when the drilling was done late in suboptimal conditions, whereas it was basically the same in organic and conventional when it was normal autumn or spring drilling. What did really change in a conventional versus organic system was the diversity of weeds. Basically, organic system with no herbicides and use of lays in the rotation have a higher number of species in the weed communities than conventional systems that rely still on herbicides to control weeds. And we know that a more diverse weed community can also, in the long run, be less dangerous. So very quickly, the perspective of how this could be useful. The first thing we're trying to do is to support on-farm evaluation. This is one of the examples, testing a simple rating about one of the key asks from organic and low-input farmers, which is the vigor. This is a visual scale to rate vigor. We tried this scale compared to all more detailed measurements and found that if we take these ratings at the onset of stem extension, as you can see from this picture, this is a very good predictor of how many weeds and how high the weed cover will be in the summer. And as well, this has proved to be a very good predictor of the yield. The more the vigor in early spring, the higher the yield. If we can validate this, this can help farmers decide, but this can also help breeders to speed up selection for traits that are more relevant for wheat competition. Second perspective, data integration. This is the key of our cooperation with the AHDB, for example. And if we relate the yield and protein, for example, to the spring rainfall across the years, we could identify the optimal rainfall ranges for yield and protein that are slightly different. But what we're doing now, as you can see from the picture on the right, is collecting a fine scale data sources to better understand climate metrics, potentially assess how to better use weather forecast results. And this is all an exciting work we will be doing during this year. And the last is, how can this actually support decision? This is actually connecting the management, the genotypes, and the environments. Let's say that we have collected so far 3 climatic scenarios: summer drought, wet summer, spring drought. Let's say that we know farms, and from the farms we know what is the most important risk for every farm. We saw the varieties and how the variety performs in every farm. And this can help us decide the varieties to better manage the risk. Remember that we drill something, but we don't know what the year is going to look like. So as a take-home message, we like to see this as a part in the journey towards the agroecological transition, which is supposed to go through the steps of efficiency, like classic IPM, optimize, pesticide use, substitution, but then system redesign, so base the system on the ecological process and underlying production as the gold standard. What is this redesign in practice? Well, first of all, it's something that we cannot do overnight because it's a continuous process. So first take-home message, especially for agronomists and farmers, don't be scared to systematically test things in farms, because real farm and field scale is absolutely essential, especially to understand, for example, weed problems. Second take-home message is not something that one can do on their own. For example, testing things in a network can provide more robust information on a wider range of options than if you were testing varieties on your own. It can support collective decision and also be directly relevant to farms that are not taking directly part into the network. In all this, I'd like to think that the future agronomist is really what's going to link evidence that we are producing from this light wheat with what is on the recommended list. So it's like it's going to be the driver on this journey. And with this, it's all for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to any questions. Thank you.
Amber, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing the further information coming through. It's really great to see real farm performance of wheat varieties using the integration of external data sources. And I do think these results are going to be really valuable for growers and agronomists, certainly looking at low input systems. Thank you very much. So our final speaker this afternoon, Patrick, will be leading discussion on how to bring the science together with the practical advice on farm. Bearing in mind the loss of active ingredients and the slowing of new developments, Patrick will highlight the need to use the recommended list as a vital tool. So thank you very much, Patrick. I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Rose, for that. Yes, the slides will be advanced on my verbal command, which sounds like I've got tremendous amount of power, really, but it isn't. It's just because we couldn't work the system. But there you go. That's what happens when you get to your dotage. I like the quote on the first part there, because really a lot of changes are happening behind the scenes, of which we're moving forward in both the agronomy aspect of it and the growers, is that change is happening now at a rate that we haven't seen for quite a long time. So if we move on to the next slide, and is this really a cusp of a change? I've spent all my life on the cusp of a change. I think when you look back, we've been waiting for hybrid wheats for over 35 years and we still haven't got them, and yet they're closer and closer. So we are seeing lots of change. And if we just advance the slides, please, for this one. Firstly, loss of actives that are coming in there. The first one being chlorpyrifos that I've put down there, chlorthalonil, which is a great loss to the disease control market. Epoxiconazole as well will be up in its use-up period this time. And anybody who grows beet will know what the impact of the loss of neonics has been for us this time. So we've got those as active ingredients. There are many, many others. There's a list of triazoles that have gone. But what we've got also is this ever-evolving resistance issues. So in cabbage stem flea beetle, we're understanding now a little bit more as we go forward with that. Aphid resistance, which is a key factor going forward, with a limited number of actives that are available for control of aphids in broadacre agriculture. And disease resistance. This is continually evolving, and the only way to stop having any disease resistance issues is not to use fungicides, which of course is not really a way that we look at in mainstream agriculture. So it's a balancing act that has to be done. If we move on to the next slide, this was when life was simple and so summarised the vast majority of the arable acreage in the UK was where we were having either 2 wheats, a wheat, a winter barley, and a winter oilseed rape. We had a full portfolio of active ingredients to basically deal with any problems that were within that rotational limits that are there. But if we advance the slides again, but very soon we were finding out that by the time we got to a second cereal, that our levels of blackgrass were increasing. In winter oilseed rape, we saw that flea beetle and pollen beetle were becoming an increasing issue in terms of how do we control them and have we any pesticides that would control them. And by the time we got back again to the first wheat, we'd got even more blackgrass that had come through from the winter oilseed rape. And by then we'd got a serious issue within our rotation. And it was all very good for the man from the accountants to say, oh, well, why aren't we growing more wheat, or why are we having to change our rotations? Because I can see that the margins, according to Mr. Nix, show that we should grow more wheat. Well, it was very obviously becoming evident to everybody that our problems within the rotation were way beyond being fixed. Next slide, please. I apologise to any of the students at Newcastle that I have lectured to in the past, but that gentleman there is Viscount Townsend, and he's best known really for the introduction of the 4-course rotation. And the thing that you have to remember from history is, I like the comment from, or should I say quote, from George Santayana, where those that cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So if we bear in mind that Mr. Townsend gave up his political career in 1730 to concentrate on improving his estate in Norfolk, and you'll see if we pop up the next slide, that we created what was loosely called the 4-course rotation. Now, for any of you who have investigated or looked at regenerative agriculture, you will rapidly start to see that what we are doing is basically repeating history and introducing those aspects that are there. But if we look at the next advancement in the slide, what we've got now is an ever-increasing portfolio that makes up our rotation. And if you look in there, you've got barley, the pulses, the brassicas, the wheat, regeneration, potential to use oats, and grass. And all of a sudden, we've gone from what was a relatively simple rotation to many people now having a much more complicated and integrated rotation. And in many ways, if you look at the 4-course rotation, we're not dissimilar to that. Yes, it's not turnips, it might be oilseed rape. Clover may be a regenerative phase, it may be a short grass lay, but they're all aspects that are there that we have adopted and are ready to use. So that's where we are now, and that has come in at relatively quick speed. You know, if we look back even 10 years, let's say, and many of the conversations I'm having with my growers now, or the decisions that you are making on farm, you would have thought 10 years ago were just really a way of losing more money, not actually improving the profitability of your client or your own farm. If we move on to the next slide, I see the recommended lists as a bit of the Swiss Army knife for growers. You know, I'm always amazed with a Swiss Army knife and the number of things that are in there. But you've got to remember, they're not actually the best tool for the job, but they do provide you with an immediate fix or an opportunity to get on to getting the right tools that are there. So I think that they're an essential part of where we're going, and moving forward, they're going to be an increasing part of our decision-making process. Maybe not the primary driver, but they are an opportunity for you as growers or the agronomists to look at them and then start to assess the risks with the varieties and how you marry varieties and how you marry cropping together to make sure that that risk level is minimized so you can manage it to the best of your ability. And on the list, if we move to the next slide, we've got aspects that are traits. So as Paul said earlier, turnip yellows is in there. Club root is an essential part of it, and I'm seeing an increasing amount of club root coming in. So the fact that we've got varieties out there that show tolerance and that we keep an assessment of their performance in the field in terms of yield compared to the other varieties, that's an important and critical part of it. The clear field varieties that are out there now that give growers the opportunity maybe to tackle areas where we've got brassica weed burdens that are in there, and no doubt more of these traits will start to come through. We've got BYDV. In barley, you've got the mosaic viruses that I can remember from the early days were actually quite yield robbing and very easy to see in the early part of spring that were there. And although there are areas now where this resistance is under pressure, or the tolerance it's there, and also with the barley now with the BYDV, so we've got 2 or 3 varieties that are showing tolerance to BYDV. These are really good traits, and particularly with the loss of insecticides that are in the marketplace, and maybe the effectiveness of the ones we've got have been greatly diminished. So in aphid terms, if you've got grain aphid and you're using a pyrethroid, then there's a fair chance that there's a level of resistance out there. With wheat, orange blossom midge, now excellent choice into the list this year for the variety Wolverine on there. Would you grow it wide scale right across the UK? Probably not, but it does give us that get out and enabling people in very hot spots for virus to get the opportunity to drill something that little bit earlier. You've got also in oilseed rape, you've got Harries and Halls. So you've got a range of traits that are there. Then if we move on to the list, and we can see where we've got the agronomic principles. We've already highlighted here the issues with monitoring, particularly yellow rust that's out there, and the rapid change in the strains that are moving across Europe. They move very quickly now, and so we're trying to address that in the recommended list, which is a starting point. But from an agronomist's point of view, what I'm looking for is the lead that gives me. So you'll notice on the watch rust that Catherine and all the parties that have been involved with this, you will see that there is within there these sort of asterisks and ratings that are indicating that it would be possible to see rust in these varieties, particularly at juvenile stages, but there is a level of adult rust resistance. None of these ratings remove the need to look or assess, so you're part of it. Standing power there, as Paul quite rightly pointed out, nobody wants a flat crop. It's the quickest way to lose money that's out there, and I think a reassessment of where we're going in standing has to be a really good version. I can't believe everything is a 7 or an 8 if that's the instance, so that's a really good review of where we're going. And yield, like many of you, I will have sat through a talk from Bill Clark from NIAB about 5 years ago and said, why don't you grow the highest yielding variety on the books? And the answer to that now is very, very clear. If the highest yielding variety has got very poor levels of disease ratings, then there is an extra cost that comes with that. And is it sustainable with the gradual diminution of products that are available? And we've also got harvest characteristics as well that are on the lists that are available. So all very useful things that are important that you understand. And you only have to go to any of the open days during the early summer, if we're allowed to have them again, that growers are actually interested in these features and do like to get the steer from people that are there. If we move on to the next slide, please. What I've got down here is I've taken wheat, and the recommended list is wheat, and in here we've got the group 1s, 2s and 3s, and it's yield with the blue dots, and it's an assessment of the disease levels across a range of sites. And you'll see there along there that the colour codes along the bottom are indicating which are the diseases. In the brackets, it's the number of sites where those were the significant disease that are there. It's not all of the AHDB sites, but it's done from a fair proportion that are in there. And you can see across the board there, the size of the graph at the bottom is indicating that is the level of disease across the range of sites. So when Catherine was going on and talking about the yellow rust, the difficulties we can see with yellow rust is not all the sites might have had yellow rust in that variety, and that refers back again to the soup issue that was raised with it. But if we move on to the next slide, when you've got a variety like Kinetic, for instance, or Kerin, we were starting to see that in much more across the country. So hence the ratings, and I think you'll find that with Skyfall and Zayat are more reflective of the amount of different sites that exhibited that as a significant disease or was recorded as a disease. You'll also notice from the current pick of varieties, we've got some very good varieties coming along with a robust level of all-round disease resistance. Things like Saki, for instance, looking very good, and Theodore, obviously at the end, which is there for its outstanding levels of control. But Gleam, you know, there are a lot of varieties on there that are exhibiting really good broad spectrum levels of disease resistance, and that transfers almost immediately into the potential for using the most cost-effective levels of fungicide that are there. Where historically as well, we have tended to lose yield when we've got this robust disease package, and to a certain extent you could see that in Theodore. But actually now, again, I'll pick on Saki there for that version, but you're getting still a very robust level of yield with a good all-round disease resistance package. So very positive there. And unfortunately, as you'll see also in several of the new varieties coming along, we're going to reintroduce mildew to you. But let's just work on where we've got these good levels of resistance, and they're very useful. If you move to the next slide. We're also going to have to reappraise ourselves in what the contribution is from each leaf to yield. So if we're looking to look at a low input fungicide regime and how that fits in, so we're using the ability of the natural resistance that's in there, then can we reassess what active ingredients we use at what stage in the plant? And it would be fair, I think, to say that if you've got a high resistant variety to a wide range of diseases, then your spend in the early part of the season is going to be considerably less than if you've got a variety like, for instance, Barrel, where you're looking to always a battle with disease. We have to accept that also these features are across the country. So the differences, say, in Cornwall to Kent are immense in terms of disease pressures that are there, and therefore the programs can alter greatly. I think if you're growing Barrel in Cornwall, then you might as well write a huge check now, because the amount of active ingredient required to keep that disease free will be very large. Next slide, please. So if we run through these, if I'm looking at winter wheat, what do I get out of the recommended list? If I pick a good disease resistant variety, my fungicide spend may be at £60. If on the other hand, I pick a variety with a poor disease rating, I might be on £120. With winter oilseed rape, if I'm looking at the recommended list that's there, if I have a 7 FOMA rating, I'm looking to see that there's a greater amount of FOMA in that crop before I'm triggered into a spray decision. If it's like leaf spot 7 rating, do I actually need to apply a product in the autumn or early spring? And if we look at this back into my rotational aspect of it, if I increase the rotational length of winter oilseed rape, we've got recorded that now we can get an extra 6% yield for the year you expand away from the last crop. So you've got good rotational reasons. and as has already been discussed without Ambro, is that many of the aspects of organic farming actually translate directly into broadacre commercial higher input farming. And it's that interpretation as we move along, how we can utilize those very effectively. Next slide, please. So if we're looking at longer rotations, here's some costings I've put down, taken out of NICS for there. So if we look at a historical rotation, I've got variable crops over a 6-year total have been 2,738 and a margin of 4,230. But I've got risks in there. These are blackgrass and cabbage stem flea beetle. They're significant risks, and I'm not likely to maintain my yield level with that as it stands at the moment. So if I introduce a new rotation and I bring in a wider range of crops, and I also work out the costings of the variable costs that are there, then that's where I am. What are my risks here? Oats and beans are commercial crops in a commercial world, so their prices are can be very fluctuating. Oats is directly related to demand. Beans likewise, and the quality of the bean that we get in whether it goes away for export or not. But if I use the optimum traits out of those varieties, so I'm looking for something with robust disease resistance, I'm looking for mosaic virus, I'm looking for turnip yellows virus, and I do the best that I can utilizing that list, I can get a better margin than where I was originally. So that's where I see those aspects of it. I think they're very important to us. Next slide, please. Right. The person on the right there, you see, is the idiot who's trying to tell these New Zealand farmers that they're going to have to spend more money on fungicides if they want to get greater yields. I'd have to say that I have been brought up in a yield of an era of what I would call innovation, but some people would have called us chemical junkies. But that's where we are. And you'll notice on the left-hand side, that is a spray store in a Brazilian farm. And I can tell you there were 8 racks that contained all the active ingredients that they were going to be putting onto their soybean and cotton or maize. So we are into the tune of a huge amount of input of ag chem across our competitor nations that were there. But even in Brazil, they use prior to growing soybean a legume called Crotalaria ochroluca, which is a catch crop which they put in before growing soya, and that basically helps the nematodes that attack the soybean are forced to flush out, and that means that there are much less of them when that soybean goes in. So even within that structure, the use of the best alternative IPM measures are very good. If we move on to the next slide, please. So are we on a brave new dawn to manage risk? We no longer pay lip service to integrated pest management. It's something that historically has been there and it's been in the background, but now it is coming much more to the foreground. Breeders will accelerate the development of positive traits because we haven't got the choice of chemistry we previously had, and we need those traits going forward. There will be an absolute plethora of more sophisticated models arriving for both disease and pest thresholds. And take my word for it that all of these won't be good initially, but eventually they will become much better. Rotations will become longer, and I think an aspect of that is more flexible. As we said before, the weather variability is rising. The rise of regenerative agriculture fueled by margin benefits over the whole rotation, but also potential funding issues that may come from central government for that type of agriculture. And at long last, we might get the long-awaited benefits of precision farming will start to appear. To me, it's like hybrid wheat. we know that the benefits precision farming can bring. We know that they are potentially there, but actually getting them practically on a small family farm or a medium-sized family farm, the trickle down is starting, and we're starting to appear to be getting those levels and understanding them. And unfortunately, part of that is data and data management that's there. Next one, please. And where do we go with gene editing? You know, if this is going to accelerate traits that are there, if it's within the same species and we can't identify it, what are we doing post-Brexit? Will that be part of it? Will be an integral part? Where does that put the recommended list when we get traits? These are big questions and big benefits. In terms of genetically modified organisms, we've now got a drought-tolerant wheat in Argentina, which is in-field yield advantages of between 5 and 40%. But that trait would actually apply in the UK if we had the ability to use it, which would mean the areas that say which suffer from summertime drought periods, which certainly would be sort of Cambridgeshire, Essex in that area. But is it acceptable? So we've got other aspects that are coming. Next slide, please. Right, the recommended list helps us choose the right crop. It helps us to choose the right variety. And with that, we can get the right result. So I think, in essence, it's my Swiss Army knife. It's where I'm going. And that's the leaving message I would like to give to you, is use it for what it is. It isn't the way to get the right things, but it's all part of a new era we're going into. And we must follow all aspects of the research that's going on. And I think some of the most important early research that we're doing in the organic sector is vital for a greater measure, because the results can be applied across the board. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you very much. That was absolutely wonderful, and certainly fighting talk for the future. We've just had a few comments coming through about the charts that were within your presentation, but Catherine's got access, so we're going to share screens with her now and just look at the yield and disease levels that are available for us to look at.
Thanks, Rose and Patrick. So yeah, Patrick showed the chart of disease levels against yield, and this is something we're looking at integrating into the variety selection tool, which you can find on the AHDB website. But at the moment, what's on there is individual charts of disease severity. So each of these different coloured dots show a different disease. Yellow is yellow rust, green is septoria, brown is brown rust, and blue is mildew. There's no mildew data available in this particular data set. These show averages of disease levels from these 7 trials shown in this map here. And you can see the yields at these 7 trials. So we've got the treated yield and the untreated yield, and the difference between them shows the treatment benefit. But for ease, the treatment benefit for each site is also shown here, and it's ordered in order of overall treatment benefit. If you then wanted to see the disease levels at one site, you would just click on that site and it shows you. So you can see here there was yellow rust and brown rust present. And just note that the disease levels shown are, the data shown are only those that were used in the rating. So there might have been another disease at the site, but either it wasn't high enough levels to be used in the ratings, or perhaps there's another disease confounding it, so we couldn't use the data. So there may well have been septoria or mildew here, but it's just not shown. So just bear that in mind when looking at these data. So yeah, but you can have a play around with that. That's available on the AHDB website under Variety Selection Tool, and this is the wheat one using data released yesterday.
Thank you for sharing that, Catherine. We'll now go through to some questions. So if anybody has any further questions, please do add them in. These panelists are here for you all today. But just to kick off, Paul, this is for you. 2 questions actually. How do you determine the optimum drilling dates for the RL trial?
So we have different drilling date targets for different crops. So for wheat, for instance, we have an early sown set. We have what's our main sown set, and then we have a late drilled set. So we obviously give ranges to the trial operators in order to get those crops in within those periods. And it's the same for other crops as well. We have defined periods. So for the wheat, for instance, as cropping patterns have changed, we've actually moved the boundaries for the drilling periods further back, because we know that people aren't drilling wheat so early as they used to. So we do adapt it to the conditions that are actually going on farm.
Thank you. And then following the launch yesterday, what were the highlights of the new varieties and anything that came off?
Sorry, Rose, you broke up quite badly. I didn't get that question.
Apologies. The recommended list was what launched yesterday, wasn't it? Were there any highlights in terms of new varieties coming on and varieties coming off the list?
How much time have I got? I mean, I think there were a couple of really interesting varieties. Wolverine has been mentioned a couple of times with BYDB resistance in wheat. It's an interesting variety. I'm sure we'll see that trait coming in more varieties going further forwards. There was for northern growers of northern agronomists who might be out there. There was an interesting variety of wheat, Swallow, and that's coming through Sonova, and that's got very good distilling characteristics. That might be take a lot of the northern distilling market. We'll have to see. Yeah, it's they were 2 certainly interesting wheat varieties. Fairly thin on new varieties on the oilseed rape, and on barley. We've got some interesting new varieties in terms of good movements forward, both in yield and disease resistance. So a couple of new hybrids with a lot better disease resistant package. Some 2-row feeds with big jumps forwards in yield. So I think there are a few interesting varieties out there.
Thank you. Seems like there's some more traits coming through that could be useful. Catherine, could you give the yellow rust ratings for Skyfall and Zayat this time, off the top of your head?
Yep, so Skyfall's got a 3 this year and Zayat's got a 5. And I did actually look at the yellow rust levels we've seen in Zayat over the last 3 years, and they've drastically increased from really quite low in 2018 to almost as much as Skyfall in 2020. So that's really where the new weighted rating will come into its own to show that. So if it's the same next year, we could see it possibly drop for that variety for Zayat.
Thank you. And then moving on slightly, Ambro, how much do heritage varieties play a part in your trials, and what benefit do they provide?
Yes, heritage varieties, first of all, I would say they play the part the farmers give them, because most of the varieties we grow is the farmers decide what to grow. What happens with heritage varieties is that generally they sort of compete with what the modern winter wheat typical variety would be, because they were all bred for milling and with low inputs. So when you reduce the input, especially the fertilizers and the herbicides, that's where they actually can compete or even outcompete the modern milling varieties. What I would say is that there are farms where they don't work well because they are tall and they can lodge even if it's an organic farm with high nitrogen level. There are organic and low input farmers, even conventional farmers, that can only grow wheat if they grow heritage-like varieties, so taller varieties. We use them also to diversify the pool of shapes of plants to try and understand better how it works. And they can definitely play a part either as preserved old varieties or as shapes for future varieties in a future landscape of breeding for low input systems.
Thank you, Ambro. Just conscious of time now, and probably not far off wrapping up. Just one last question for all of you, but I think I might start with Patrick, and intrigued as to what he has to say first. Could growing variety mixes be a good way to help protect against disease? And how should you go about picking a mixture beyond just end-use requirement?
That's an interesting one, because I was involved way back in the early 80s when we had yellow rust issues then, and we had a very small portfolio of effective fungicides at the moment in time. And it was in a simplistic stage when races were given an individual name. I believe it was Brigand when we were there. And the means of trying to combat yellow rust was having varieties that had different resistance to the ratings and came in and did it that way. So I'm not ruling those mixes out, but that was the reason for choice then, was their resistance to the various races that were there, and working out that if it got into one variety, then that wasn't the end of the world. So I think we're using 3 varieties at the time. There's a lot of interest in using blends out there. There is an end market problem, which you've quite rightly pointed out, that's there. But if I remember rightly from the time back in the early 80s, what you got was not an increase in yield, but you tended to get the yield of the highest component within that lot. So I think going forward, it may be more interested in if we cease to get a supply of new active ingredients in disease terms. So it's the work has been done, but historically, so whether it's to be done again, I don't know. Maybe Paul will have a comment.
Any thoughts, Paul? It certainly keeps coming up in conversation this year.
I know the Danish variety trials do include some variety mixtures. It's not something we're looking at actively at the moment. I think we would want to see a market for those mixtures. You could see certainly within the feed sector, there was no reason why you couldn't really grow mixtures or blends, and perhaps as we see the declining portfolio of active ingredients go down even further, perhaps that was what people will be looking at growing. Whether breeders will come out with their design blends with 20% of this and 20% of that and 50% of something else, we'll have to see how this develops, or whether it just becomes a sort of on-farm, do-it-yourself kind of blend. But I think it probably is something we will see more of going forwards in conventional systems as well as in organic, where I know people do already grow them.
Just mentioning organic, Amber, have you got anything in the live week this year?
Yes, we are testing a two-way mixture of Seaskin, which is our control variety, and X-Days, which is a new, relatively new Group 2 variety. We're especially interested not only in the disease ratings, but also in the different way they look at the early stages. So very vigorous X-Days, but then tends to be too early, whereas Seaskin is shyer, I would say, in the early stages, and see how this can compensate. But mixtures do have a part in the future. I just, from an organic and low input point of view, I just can't understand why they disappeared, especially because disease is one thing. There are many other aspects to consider when you reduce the input levels, and they can be an important tool to get consistency across several stresses. So I think we do need to work again on mixtures.
And just quickly, last 2 questions that have come through, but they're good questions. Paul, I think, talking about disappearing varieties, do you conduct any trials with older varieties such as Clare or Oakley, and seen any on-farm trial data that would seem to indicate the differences between newer varieties and older varieties? It's not as great as it suggests.
In terms of whether we do trial all varieties, no, we don't. Once something comes off the recommended list, then we stop trialing it. The recommended list is really looking at about the new varieties and providing information on those new varieties. In terms of do varieties always perform on farm as well as they do in the recommended list? I'm sure they don't always, and that's why I said in my presentation that the recommended list is just a starting point, because we can't trial varieties in every situation that they're going to be grown commercially, and so it's really up to people to take those varieties up, the ones that look most promising for their situation, have a try out and see how they do on farm, because they won't always perform as well on farm as they do in the recommended list.
No, very fair. Thank you very much. And then lastly, Patrick, do you have a preferred rotation for the future? And Ambro, maybe, I don't know whether you could chip into this as well with your live wheat.
If I had a preferred rotation, it would include grass, some form of greenery in there like that. I'm still trying to work out how I'm going to make money out of grass, but it would be a very, I would find it as a very useful tool in a break crop scenario. So I think that's what I would look to see. I'd also try and keep wheat as a primary crop that would be within there. But as you've shown from the rotation, using a mix of species over the rotation does enable us to get the best out of the individual components. So that's what I would say in that aspect.
And I agree completely with Patrick, and I would just add something that he mentioned in his presentation. So grass, especially legumes, more species, and also flexibility, because I'm wondering more and more with these climatic extremes whether there should be a portfolio of options where can make the cropping system more adaptable to changing conditions. And I think read some papers coming from the US on how this can actually make to work, and a rotation that is less rigid, less on schedule, can actually help make the systems more resilient. So resilience is not just in the genes of the varieties, it's also into the decision making. That's what I would add.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I think, just conscious of time, that leaves me really to thank you all very much for joining us this morning. I hope everybody else has enjoyed it just as much as I have. So yeah, Catherine, Patrick, Ambro, Paul, thank you very kindly. The next session today is at 2 o'clock, and that is fungicide performance and programs. We would appreciate your feedback. As with everything that we do, please fill in the session feedback form. I do hope that next year is slightly different to this year, but it's always good to hear what you think. Basis and Laroso codes, they're both on here now, so take a note of those and then pop them in the information on the left-hand side. But thank you all very much for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the week and look forward to seeing you soon.